I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the thing nobody talks about when they tell this story. Everyone remembers the gate. Everyone remembers what happened after. But nobody asks why a junior diplomatic courier from the Terran envoy's office was standing 40 meters away with a data tablet clutched to his chest and absolutely nowhere else to go. My name is Davin Reyes. I was 26 years old. I had been on Vethara Prime for 11 days, and I had spent most of those 11 days doing exactly what junior couriers do, sorting communiques, verifying seal authentications, fetching warm beverages for people far more important than me, and trying very hard not to stare at the sky, which was the color of old copper and smelled faintly of ozone even when the weather was calm. Vethara Prime is not a hostile world. I want to make that clear before I describe what I saw, because the instinct, the very human instinct, is to reach for the word dangerous when talking about the Vethali. They are large. They move in ways that the human eye takes a few days to stop finding unsettling, this slow liquid grace that looks like it should produce sound but doesn't. Their faces are built for expressions we don't have words for. Their cities are vertical in ways that ours simply aren't. Everything reaching upward in these layered tiers, connected by transit rails that hum at a frequency just low enough that you feel it in your back teeth before you hear it. Not hostile, just different in ways that matter. The Empress's palace sat at the center of Vethakara, the capital, on a raised platform of polished black stone that the locals called the Vethsira, the still place, the place where noise stops. And the noise really did stop, or nearly. I had walked past the outer perimeter twice during my first week there, and each time I had experienced this odd sensation, like stepping into a room where someone has just stopped speaking. A held breath, a pause between heartbeats. The palace itself was beautiful in the way that glaciers are beautiful, vast and cold, and somehow indifferent to whether you appreciated it or not. Thousands of years of Vethali architecture piled on top of itself, each dynasty adding its own layer, each layer a slightly different shade of the same dark stone. At the very top, catching the copper light, were the banners of the current dynasty, long black strips with a single vertical silver line, the mark of House Vethsoruna, which had held the throne for 412 years. The gate at the base of the Vethsira platform was not the main ceremonial entrance. That was on the far side, facing the Great Plaza, where delegations arrived on formal days with their banners and their honor guards and all the theater that interstellar diplomacy requires. This gate, the one I was standing near on that particular morning, was the Eastern Service entrance. Tradespeople used it, support staff. Occasionally, lower-ranking functionaries from the various embassies, if they had business that didn't rate the front door. I was there because I had a physical document that needed physical delivery to a physical desk inside the palace administrative wing, and the front entrance protocol for something like that involved 3 separate queues, 2 authentication panels, and a wait time of approximately 4 hours. The Eastern Gate, theoretically, was faster. Theoretically, what was actually happening at the Eastern Gate when I arrived was something I had no preparation for, no context for, and absolutely no business being anywhere near. I heard it before I saw it. Not the voice, not yet, just the quality of the air changing. The way the small crowd of tradespeople and functionaries who had been queuing at the Eastern Gate had gone very, very still. I came around the corner of the last service road, a narrower passage between 2 residential towers, paved in the same dark stone as everything else, and I stopped. There was a Terran standing at the gate. Not in line, not waiting, standing directly at the gate itself, about 2 meters from the closed panel, feet shoulder-width apart, hands at his sides. He was wearing Terran civilian clothes, dark trousers, a gray jacket that had seen better days, boots that were caked with pale Vethali dust. No diplomatic insignia. No envoy's badge, nothing that would have explained his presence or given him any standing whatsoever in this particular location. He looked like a man who had walked very far to get somewhere and had arrived and was not moving. The gate was flanked by 4 Vethali palace guards. I had seen the palace guards before in passing, and they had registered as impressive in the abstract way that things register when you know they're impressive, but haven't had cause to think too hard about why. Standing here now, watching 4 of them at close range as they dealt with a situation that had clearly exceeded their standard operational parameters, I understood why more concretely. Vethali palace guards are selected from a warrior caste called the Vethkora, the standing ones, the ones who do not move. They average about 2.5 meters in height. Their armor is not the decorative kind. It is functional, fitted to their specific body geometry, and is composed of a material that the Terran Envoy's office briefing documents described as impact-resistant composite alloy with integrated neural response capacity, which is diplomatic language for it thinks along with the person wearing it. Each guard carries a long staff weapon called a vethalera, the silencing arm, that can be used in approximately 12 different configurations depending on what is required. They were not using any of those configurations right now. They were just standing there, all four of them, looking at this one human man, and the man was looking back. I found a spot near the corner of a support pillar, not hiding exactly, but not advertising my presence either, and I watched. The man at the gate was not young. Late 40s, maybe 50, I thought at the time. He had the kind of face that has earned every line on it. Brown skin weathered darker by what I later understood had been years spent in environments that weren't designed for human bodies. Gray at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been set hard enough, long enough, that it had simply decided to stay that way. He was not afraid. I want to be precise about this because I have seen people pretend not to be afraid, and I have seen people who are afraid but functioning through it, and I have seen people who are genuinely not afraid, and those are three different things that look different if you know what you're looking for. This man was the third kind, not performing calm, not managing fear, just not afraid. Standing at the gate of an alien Empress's palace, surrounded by guards twice his height, in a world that was not his, and simply waiting. One of the guards, the tallest of the four, which is saying something, stepped forward. Vethali's speech is not always accessible without a translator, but the guard's tone required no translation. It was the universal sound of authority being asserted in a situation where authority feels uncertain. The man answered, in Vethali, not translator-assisted Vethali, which sounds clipped and slightly mechanical because the buffer always runs about a half-second behind the speaker. Actual Vethali, spoken at Vethali pace, with the tonal variations that change meaning from sentence to sentence. I don't speak Vethali. I can identify when someone is speaking it correctly versus badly, and I can tell the difference between a greeting and a demand by sound alone, which is the extent of 11 days' worth of incidental exposure. This man was speaking it correctly, more than correctly. The guard's posture changed. It was subtle. Vethali physiological responses are not as legible to human observers as human physiological responses are to each other. But I caught it. A slight reconfiguration of weight. The staff weapon, which had been angled forward, shifted back to neutral. The second guard spoke, then the third. The man answered each of them in turn, measured and unhurried. There was a long pause. Then the tallest guard turned slightly and spoke into a communication relay on the gate panel. And the gate didn't open, but the conversation changed quality, and I understood that someone on the other side was now involved. The woman who eventually appeared at the gate was not a guard. She was smaller than the guards, still taller than the human man, but only by about a head, and she wore the gray and silver administrative colors of the palace civil service. A senior functionary, I guessed. Her movements were quick and precise where the guards were slow and deliberate, and she spoke rapidly when she arrived, addressing the man with what sounded like a question that expected an obvious answer. He gave her what she'd asked for. She went still. Not the way the guards had gone still. They had gone still in the manner of entities, deciding whether a situation required action. She went still in the way of someone receiving information that is reorganizing something fundamental. I would later learn that what the man had given her was a name. Specifically, his name and his designation, his full designation, including the classification code that explained precisely who he was and what he had done, and why, of all the humans in the Terran diplomatic infrastructure, this particular man standing at this particular gate might actually have a right to be taken seriously. In that moment, I didn't know any of that. I just saw a palace administrator go very still, look at a human man, look at the gate, look at the man again, and then, with the speed of someone who has correctly identified that a decision needs to be made faster than the normal process allows, speak rapidly into her own communications device. One of the tradespeople who had been standing frozen in the queue behind the man, a Vethali merchant with bolts of iridescent fabric strapped across a wide-frame cargo sled, leaned over and said something to his companion. His companion made a sound that I recognized after 11 days as the Vethali equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. I looked around. More people had gathered. Not a crowd, but more than had been there before. A cluster of palace staff who had found reasons to be near the east corridor. A pair of what looked like residential maintenance workers who had stopped working and started watching. 3 other members of various non-Terran diplomatic corps, easily identifiable by their insignia, all with the same expression, which is to say, the alien-specific version of the expression that means, I am witnessing something I am going to be describing later. The gate remained closed. The man remained where he was. Here is what I knew at this point, because I eventually learned to do the math. The Terran envoy's office had been trying to schedule a formal audience with Empress Vethsoruna III for 6 weeks. The Empress had been, in the careful language of palace functionaries, unavailable for new diplomatic engagements at this time. This was not unusual. The Empress was the head of state of a civilization that encompassed 12 star systems, 17 subject worlds, and a bureaucratic apparatus that had been running continuously for longer than most Terran nations had existed. Her schedule was managed by a system so layered and so intricate that it was essentially a civilization unto itself. She had audiences with foreign dignitaries twice per standard cycle, with a waiting list that currently extended approximately 8 months into the future. What was also true, though I didn't know it yet, standing at that corner with my data tablet, was that the Empress had a debt. Not a diplomatic debt, not a trade obligation, not a treaty commitment. A personal one, the kind that doesn't appear in any formal registry. The kind that lives in a specific corner of a specific person's memory and quietly dictates certain things about how that person moves through the world. The man at the gate knew about this debt. He had not made any appointments. He had not gone through the Terran envoy's office. He had not filed any of the forms that would have put him in a queue. He had simply arrived at the eastern service gate of the Vethakara Imperial Palace at 7 in the morning local time and asked to speak with the Empress. And because of who he was, because of what he'd done, and what she owed, and what that meant, the eastern gate of the Imperial Palace was now experiencing a situation that its guards were not equipped to handle independently. The administrator came back. She walked back to the gate and she looked at the man and she spoke to him, and even without understanding the words I could hear the question in it. Not a challenge, an actual question, something like, "Are you certain?" The man answered, one short sentence. She nodded. She turned and gave a short instruction to one of the guards, who moved to the gate panel and entered something that required his palm, his staff weapon's authentication signature, and a code that I saw him speak aloud rather than enter physically. The gate, which was a solid panel of the same dark stone as the platform it was set into, recessed and slid to the right. The man picked up the bag that had been sitting at his feet. I hadn't noticed it before, a plain travel pack, the kind you'd buy in any transit terminal, and walked through. The gate closed. The queue of tradespeople stood there for a moment in the charged silence. Then slowly things began to move again. People talked. The merchants started sorting themselves back into the line. The maintenance workers went back to their work, but slowly, in the way of people who are thinking about what they just saw. I looked down at my data tablet. I had a document to deliver. I got back in the queue. What happened next, I did not witness directly. I have pieced it together from multiple sources: testimony, records, the account of the administrator who was there, the account of the Empress's personal secretary, and eventually, years later, from the man himself, over a meal in a completely different city on a completely different world, when he had decided that it was all right for some version of it to exist somewhere outside of his own memory. I will tell it as close to as it happened as I understand it to have happened. The man was taken through the eastern service corridors of the palace, not the ceremonial routes, not the diplomatic processing halls, but the working corridors, the ones used by staff and maintenance and the ordinary functioning of an imperial household. He walked these corridors with the administrator, whose name was Velashara, senior coordinator of external affairs for the Eastern Wing, and 2 of the guards, and he walked at Velashara's pace, and he did not seem bothered by the route or the lack of ceremony. Velashara, who had been in imperial service for 23 years and had handled 14 official first contact scenarios and 11 post-conflict diplomatic openings, and one event she was still contractually forbidden from describing in any specificity, told him as they walked that the Empress had been informed, and that she would decide. She made clear that the decision was not guaranteed to go in his favor. She used specific language designed to manage expectations. The man thanked her. He told her that he understood. She looked at him, she said later, and she thought, this one is telling the truth. They were taken to a waiting room on the western side of the administrative wing, not the formal diplomatic waiting rooms, which were designed to communicate imperial grandeur in ways that made visitors feel appropriately small, but a smaller, quieter room used for internal meetings. There were long benches of pale wood along two walls, a window that looked out over a formal garden, a water system on the far wall. The room smelled faintly of whatever passed for a cleaning agent in this palace, which was clean and slightly floral and not unpleasant. The man sat down. He put his bag beside him. He looked at the garden through the window. Velashara stood near the door. She was not required to stay. She had other duties, a full day's worth of them, but she found herself staying. She said later that she had watched many people in that waiting room over the years, and that people waited in different ways, and that this man's way of waiting was unusual. He was not performing patience. He was not managing anxiety. He was not checking anything or reviewing anything or rehearsing anything. He was just waiting, sitting with his bag beside him, looking at the garden, being present in the room in the way that a stone is present in a stream. An hour passed. Then a door opened that was not the door they had come through, and a different figure appeared, not Velashara's staff rank, not administrative colors, but the deep blue of the Empress's personal household. The personal secretary. He was ancient by any species measure, with the particular quality that senior Vethali in service develop over decades, a kind of weight to his movements, like each one has been considered and found worth making. He looked at the man. He said something in Vethali, and from the man's response, a single word, then a short phrase, Velashara understood that he had been asked something about his purpose, and that he had answered in a way that the secretary accepted. The secretary turned and went back through the door. He left it open. The man stood up, picked up his bag, and followed. The throne room of Empress Vethsoruna III is not called the throne room. The Vethali do not, as a cultural matter, have a single room for the performance of imperial authority. What they have instead is a network of spaces that shift function depending on what the Empress needs them to be. Reception chambers, deliberation halls, audience spaces of various formality levels, each serving a different register of interaction. What the man was taken to was a space the palace staff called the Vethsira, the quiet room, the room for things that need to be said privately. It was small by palace standards, 20 meters perhaps from wall to wall, with the ceiling arching up into the dimness at a height that was hard to gauge precisely. The floor was the same black stone as everywhere in the palace, but here it had been polished to a mirror finish that reflected the light from a series of narrow windows running high up along the south wall. There was almost no furniture, a low platform on the far end, no higher than a meter, and on it a single flat seat that was the functional equivalent of a chair for someone with Vethali geometry. On the seat was the Empress. I have been asked many times what she was like. People who know I have some connection to this story always want me to describe her, as if I was there, as if I had seen her. I wasn't there, but the man described her to me once, and I will use his description, because it is better than anything I would invent. He said she looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had gotten very good at carrying it, but hadn't forgotten what the weight felt like. The room had no one else in it, no guards, no functionaries, no attendants, just the Empress on her seat and the man standing in the center of the room with his travel pack at his feet. She spoke first. She said his name, his full name in the Vethali rendering of it, which takes a human name and runs it through their phonological system and produces something that sounds like the original but harmonically richer, like hearing a familiar melody played on an instrument you've never encountered before. He bowed his head briefly, the Vethali equivalent of acknowledging someone's authority without prostrating yourself, a gesture that falls somewhere between a nod and a formal inclination, and which requires knowing the Vethali well enough to understand when it's appropriate and when it's insufficient. She said, "You came alone." He said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't go through the envoy." He said, "This isn't an envoy matter." There was a pause. She said, no, it isn't. The man's name was Calder Oren. He held no formal title within the Terran diplomatic apparatus, which is part of why he hadn't gone through the envoy's office. He held no political office. He had not, in fact, been in any official capacity for about 3 years, during which time he had been, as far as anyone could tell from the records, traveling, and doing so quietly, without particular concern for making his itinerary available to anyone. Before the 3 years of quiet traveling, Calder Oren had been the chief negotiator for the Terran-Vethali Joint Crisis Committee. This requires some explanation, and the explanation requires going back 9 years. 9 years before the morning I stood at the eastern gate, there had been an incident. The diplomatic records call it the Velthara misalignment, a careful, bloodless term for what was, in more direct language, a situation that came approximately 4 days from becoming a war. The details are partially classified and partially simply technical in ways that require years of context to understand, but the core of it was this. A Terran deep range survey vessel had passed through a region of space that the Vethali considered sovereign in ways that the Terran Survey Division had not correctly understood, and the Vethali military had responded in a manner that the Terran government had interpreted as an act of aggression, and both sides had begun moving assets in ways that made the other side move more assets. And within 3 weeks, a situation had developed that had every attribute of a crisis except for the actual shooting. Calder Oren had been put in a room with the Vethali equivalent of his position, a senior functionary from the Imperial Strategy Secretariat, a woman named Veth Kassara, and told to work it out. He had done so, eventually. It had taken 6 weeks of continuous negotiation, during which time he had slept rarely and eaten irregularly, and had spent so long immersed in Vethali communication systems that he had begun, by the end, to dream in something that was neither Vethali nor his native language, but a hybrid of the two that didn't entirely make sense in either direction. The misalignment was resolved. The survey vessel's crew came home. The assets on both sides stood down. Most people had never heard of any of it, because the whole point of that kind of work is that if it succeeds, no one ever knows how close things came to going differently. What most people definitely didn't know, because it had happened in a closed session, with no formal record, during the final 72 hours of the negotiation when things had become genuinely uncertain, was that Empress Vethsoruna III had made a personal decision to allow the negotiation to continue when her military advisors had been urging her to consider other options. She had made that decision based on a direct communication she had received from Calder Oren. Not from the Terran government, not from the envoy's office. From him personally in Vethali in language that was not diplomatic language, that made no official promises and offered no treaty terms and simply said, in effect, I believe we can do this. Give me the time. If I'm wrong, I'll know before you do, and I'll tell you. She had given him the time. He had not been wrong. The debt was not official. It was not recorded anywhere. It was not the kind of thing that gets written into treaties or cited in diplomatic correspondence. It lived in the specific quiet space between what the Empress had done and what that doing had risked, and it lived in the equally specific quiet space between what Calder Oren had promised and what he had delivered. 3 years ago, he had disappeared from the official diplomatic landscape. And now he was here. What do you want? She asked him. He had expected this question. He had been thinking about how to answer it for a long time, he told me later. Not because the answer was complicated, but because the truth of it was in some ways harder to say than a complicated thing would have been. He said, there's a world called Marath 7. It's in the disputed corridor. She said nothing, she was listening. He said, 40,000 Vethali citizens have been there for 11 years, running an agricultural development program. The program is successful. The world has been reclassified 3 times, and each time the reclassification extended their authorization to stay. He paused. 12,000 Terran settlers landed there 4 years ago. There was no conflict. The territories are separate. Different biomes, different water systems, different everything. He stopped. She said, and now? He said, and now the Disputed Corridor Oversight Authority has scheduled a full territorial review for next cycle. The DCOA has a new chair who has views about mixed occupation zones that are specific. The review process, under his interpretation, allows for mandatory withdrawal orders if either occupying group cannot demonstrate primary territorial claim. She was still. He said the Vethali population has a stronger claim. They were there first. Their infrastructure is deeper. Their environmental integration is more complete. Under standard assessment criteria, they should be fine. She said, but. He said, the new chair isn't using standard criteria. He's using a reinterpretation that weights certain types of documentation. Documentation that the Vethali program has, but that isn't formatted in the way the reinterpretation requires. It's a bureaucratic technicality, but a technicality that, if applied, leaves the Vethali population without the standing to contest a withdrawal order. He paused again. She said, and the Terran settlers. He said would be allowed to stay, because their documentation happens to be in the format the reinterpretation prefers. Not because they planned it that way. They didn't. It's coincidence, an ugly one. There was a long silence. He said, I know what this looks like. I know how it reads from your position. I know that the history between our governments on matters of territorial precedence doesn't exactly recommend Terran good faith. She said, no. He said, I'm not here as a Terran representative. I'm not here to protect the settlers. They have people for that. He stopped. Then, I'm here because 40,000 of your people are about to get expelled from a world they've spent 11 years building into something, because of a paperwork technicality that no one in the DCOA is going to push back on because the new chair has political backing and nobody wants the fight. She said, why would you care? It wasn't a question in the usual sense. It was the question, the real one, the one everything else had been leading to. He took a moment before he answered. He said, because I spent 6 weeks 9 years ago in a room trying to convince people on both sides that what we were doing was worth doing. That it was possible to sit across from someone whose geometry is different from yours, and whose history is different from yours, and whose sky is a different color, and actually work something out. And I believed it then, and I believe it now. And I don't want to watch 40,000 people get expelled from their homes, because a bureaucrat found a technicality, and no one with enough standing to fight it is willing to stand up and fight it. She looked at him for a long time. She said, you came alone. He said, yes. She said, without authorization. He said, yes. She said, without any standing that would require me to receive you. He said, yes. She said, and yet you asked, and here we are. He said, I thought the debt meant I could ask. I finished my errand at the eastern gate eventually. I delivered my document, collected the acknowledgement seal, and went back to the envoy's office in the diplomatic quarter, which was a 40-minute transit ride on a rail system that hummed in my back teeth. The morning went on. I sorted more communiques. I brought someone a warm beverage. I filed some authentication records. Around midday, my supervisor, a career diplomat named Soren Tallies who had been in the service for 20 years and had the particular quality of someone who has learned to be unsurprised at exactly the right moments, looked up from his desk and said, without preamble, the Empress is calling an emergency session of the Disputed Corridor Oversight Authority. I looked up. He said, she is formally contesting the documentation framework being applied to the Marath 7 Territorial Review. She's citing the Velthara Accords, Subclause 14, which gives either signatory the right to challenge procedural interpretations that affect established populations in contested zones. He looked at me. Someone apparently briefed her very thoroughly on the specifics this morning. I said nothing. He said, the new DCOA chair is going to fight it, but the legal basis is sound. The review will be suspended pending resolution, probably 6 to 8 months. In that time, the Vethali program documentation can be reformatted to meet the new standards. I said, the 40,000 people will be able to stay. He looked at me slightly differently. How did you know about the 40,000 people? I said, I was at the eastern gate this morning. He put down what he was holding. He said, tell me everything you saw. I told him. He listened. He asked 2 clarifying questions. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way of someone doing the math and not being entirely surprised by the answer. He said, Calder Oren. I said, I didn't know his name at the time. He said, no, you wouldn't have. He paused. He was the best negotiator I ever worked with, maybe the best the service has produced in 30 years. He burned out after the misalignment. Too much, too fast, too long. Took some recovery time and then more recovery time and eventually just stopped coming back. He looked at me. He's been traveling. Apparently he still keeps his ear to the ground. I said he didn't have any official standing. He just showed up. Soren Tallies nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, that's very Calder. I said, why did the Empress receive him? He said, because he earned it. 9 years ago, in a room with no witnesses and no recording and no treaty language, he told her the truth when he didn't have to and kept a promise he didn't have to keep. Some debts aren't written down anywhere. They just exist, between specific people, in the specific moments when they were made. I sat with that for a moment. He said, the DCOA chair is furious. The Vethali Foreign Affairs Office is scrambling to figure out who briefed the Empress and through what channel. The Terran Envoy's office, meaning us, is also scrambling because we don't know what happened and we should know what happened. He looked at me again. And one junior courier was at the eastern gate and saw the whole thing. I said I didn't see much, just him standing at the gate. I didn't know who he was. He said, sometimes that's enough. The Marath 7 review was suspended. The documentation was reformatted over the following 8 months. The 40,000 Vethali citizens of the Agricultural Development Program did not receive withdrawal orders. The 12,000 Terran settlers stayed too. The DCOA chair resigned 14 months later for reasons officially described as personal, but widely understood as related to the fact that his documentation framework reinterpretation had been picked apart by 3 separate legal challenges, and found, in the polite language of the ruling, to be insufficiently supported by the treaty architecture it purported to reference. None of that happened publicly. None of it made the kind of news that you could point to and say, here, this was the moment. It happened in the slow, grinding, important way that most of the things that actually matter happen, through filings and challenges and bureaucratic processes, and the long patience of people willing to work within a system, even when the system is being used against them. Calder Oren was not credited in any of it. His name did not appear in any formal record of the process. He was gone before the first hearing was even scheduled, back to whatever quiet traveling he had been doing before he decided that a particular morning at a particular gate was worth a very long walk. I met him years later, as I said. It was at an outdoor restaurant in a transit hub on a world called Jessen's Point, which is neither particularly beautiful nor particularly notable, but is located at the intersection of several major shipping routes, and therefore has the quality that transit hubs develop. A certain compressed humanity, every kind of person passing through on their way to somewhere else. He was sitting alone, eating something that steamed, reading from a small physical book. He looked older. He had more gray. The jaw was the same. The stillness was the same. I recognized him from the eastern gate, from the shape of how he waited. I introduced myself. I told him I'd been there. I told him I'd been the junior courier at the corner, the one who'd watched him standing at the gate 11 years earlier. He looked at me for a moment. Then he smiled slowly in the way of someone who doesn't smile quickly but means it when they do. He said, "Small galaxy." I said, "Did you know it was going to work?" He thought about it. He said, "I knew she'd see me. I wasn't sure what she'd do after." I said, "Because of the debt." He said, "Because she's a person who pays what she owes. That's not a small thing in any species. It's not guaranteed, but it's reliable when you find it, and I'd found it 9 years earlier." I said, "What made you go? You were out. You'd been out for years. What made you decide that particular morning was the morning to walk up to the palace gate?" He was quiet for a moment. The steam rose off his food. Around us, the transit hub moved in its constant way, people going places, the air full of a dozen languages and the smell of transit-grade food service. He said, "I was sitting somewhere reading about Marath 7, about the documentation issue, about the timeline of the review, and I did the math on what was going to happen if nobody said anything to anybody with enough standing to make something different happen." He paused. "And then I thought, I have a standing that's not written down anywhere. I have a debt that's not in any registry, and I can walk to that gate or I cannot walk to that gate." He looked at me. 40,000 people, he said. "That's a lot of people to let get expelled from their homes because you decided the walk was too long." There is something I think about when I tell this story. The Empress of a 12-system civilization could have said no. She had no formal obligation to open that gate. Calder Oren had no title, no office, no treaty standing, no authorization. He was one human, in civilian clothes, with a travel pack and a case he believed in, standing at a service entrance at 7 in the morning. She could have sent word through the administrator. The gate remains closed. But she had made a promise 9 years before, in a room with no witnesses, and the promise had been kept, and she knew the cost of what it had taken to keep it, and she knew the quality of the person who had kept it. And so when Velishara came to her with the name, she didn't say no. She said, let him in. Because some debts aren't written down anywhere. They don't appear in registries or formal records or diplomatic archives. They live in the specific, quiet space between what was promised and what was done, between what was risked and what was honored. They live there for years sometimes, patient, still, waiting for the morning when the person who holds them shows up at your gate. And when he does, you open it. Because that's what it means to be someone who pays what they owe. In any species, on any world, under any sky,